The original Zombies characters may be back already much sooner than we thought we were going to hear from them when we learned that apparently they will be returning in COD 2025 Zombies, Black Ops 7 or whatever it ends up being called. And this may be on some sort of Origins reimagining map, diving deeper into the crazy place, which seems to be the new iteration of it in the boss arena on Citadelle Des Morts, but we're going to explore it even further in this following map, judging by the symbols on the giant rocks aligning, and it being leaked that similar pillars from that boss fight will in fact be on the next map, the DLC 2 excavation site. With the release of Citadelle Des Morts, we have so many fresh mysteries that no one is talking about, but one of the most compelling to me is that the Owl and his 4 illegitimate sons, though we only have limited information related to them, what we do know relates to their personalities, each very different from one another. While these characters seem interesting in their own right, what if I were to tell you that there is a decent chance that these are actually alternative versions of our original characters? Let's break it down before we get into how this could even make sense to begin with, because you may think, should they even really still exist? And in fact, there is writing in blood on the map that says bastards never die, which almost sounds like a continuation of PRIMIS will fail. These characters live on forever. The Owl's formal name being Guy de Saint Michel. I'm going to play the 4 bastards intel for you now so you can learn about these characters.
Guy de Saint Michel, known to most as the Owl, the man who may have single-handedly destroyed the legendary Knights Templar. Guy was the leading expert of his day in all matters occult. His prowess in the dark arts won him his Nightbird sobriquet. That reputation made it easy to accuse the Templars of heresy, and while their leadership was burned at the stake, the Owl escaped to Avalon. But he would have never succeeded without his bastards. 4 sons who stopped at nothing to win his favor. Their true names are lost to history, but their noms de guerre still inspire fear and hatred. The Stag was his shock trooper, striking like lightning when least expected. The Dragon's scorched earth tactics betrayed his reptilian lack of mercy. The Lion was the brightest of the 4, always keen to please his master. And the Raven, like his father, was a creature of the shadows. And although they served him faithfully, the Owl would never acknowledge their birthright, much less knight them. Nor would he give them what they desired most: love, respect, recognition. They were useful as thugs, enforcers. Sadly, all relationships, even those built on love, respect, and recognition, will break in time. But the Bastard's reign of terror in what would become Avalon echoed through the ages, giving rise to the French Syndicate.
And then I'm going to break it down on who each of them may represent if they are in fact the original crew. Each of the sons are represented by an animal and described very briefly in the map across a few quotes. Let's break down each animal, what its son is described as, then use that to find potential characters they could be from the original crew. And don't forget, the origin statues of PRIMIS are literally holding swords. Firstly, the Stag. The Stag is described as striking quickly, deadly, and only once like lightning. He was an efficient and quick assassin, which puts him as clearly the most similar to Takeo Masaki, an ancient and effective samurai warrior, last of the dying samurai spirit and renowned across Japan for his efficiency in battle. The Stag, however, was also the one we get the least amount of information on, so we will move on to speculating about the others. Secondly, the Dragon. The Dragon is described as having been a force of destruction, who loved battle battle and explosions and fire. Kraft said that had he ever been able to wield the Sword of Fire we unlock in the map, he would have burned down all of Avalon.
Had the dragon ever wielded such a blade, he would surely have immolated all of Avalon.
And even makes reference to how fire destroyed Richtofen's life.
Grief is incomprehensibly powerful. The fire that took Richtofen's family turned him into a monster.
We can also see in his salute, which are each of the inspects of the respective swords, that he does a throat-slitting motion, showing just how combative and destructive he was. While initially, dragons may make you think of Gorod Krovi and thus Nikolai, I believe with what we have learned about the dragon, he is far more likely to be a version of Dempsey.
Now this ought to be a good time. It just blew him all over the place. Wow.
Dempsey is a character who loved battle, explosions, and is the most like a destructive force of the original characters, being so unhinged. And as we delve into the Lion, it will become more clear why Dempsey is the more clear-cut candidate for the dragon. Speaking of the Lion, what we learn of him is that he is brave, he did what needed to be done, and he was the one most proud to follow their father's orders, described as a good soldier. The Lion imagery, when put with the original characters, is also interesting because it calls back to the Black Ops 3 multiplayer map Citadel, which is literally coming full circle now that we have Citadelle Des Morts. In the Citadel multiplayer map, we see an ancient battle having been fought with what looks like Warhammer-esque futuristic knight armor. We see that an army led by a Lion King has attacked the Snake King in what looks to be his kingdom in order to take the Chronorium from him. It's so cool the odd time when we get a canonical zombies-influenced multiplayer map, and this was clearly meant to be important for the lore, showing an alternative universe version of PRIMIS. Reflected with the later story events of Nikolai finally taking the Chronorium from Richtofen to stop the cycle / the Grey War in Black Ops 4, it becomes very evident. The one who was willing to do what needed to be done, the Lion, was Nikolai. The Lion and Nikolai, thematically, are also both known as good soldiers. I think Citadel was intentionally meant to foreshadow what was going to happen inside of Black Ops 4 Zombies, and since Jason Blundell was a studio head at the time, he got to oversee the entire game, and his big passion was zombies, of course. And he used multiplayer to reveal zombies lore aspects too that he couldn't fit into the mode itself in its regular fashion, just like the Infected multiplayer map in that game had loads of zombies Easter eggs, and it even foreshadowed going to Dr. Monty's house at the end of that game. Now for the Raven. In Origins, Richtofen is associated with the Odin robot. During the main quest, each staff needs to be inserted into one of the robots. Richtofen's staff, Boreas's Fury, the Staff of Wind, goes in Odin. Odin is consistently associated with ravens, specifically having two companions, Memory and Thought, this itself being significant to the nature of the Dark Aether. And of course, ravens have appeared thematically throughout Call of Duty for a while, being a big part of Black Ops 3's campaign and even showing up, for example, under Eisendrache. This all ties together when considering what Kraft states about the Raven. He is the most like his father of any of the brothers, the Owl being the foremost expert in the occult of this day, having access, as we can see, to genuine magic. If the Raven is most similar to his father, therefore he is the most knowledgeable of the brothers in such matters, much like Richtofen in the original crew. We also know the Raven has a void, where his soul should be, reflected in the void powers of his blade, and part of the reason he was so capable with dark magic.
Darkness is a cunning enemy. Thirdly, which sacrifice mistaken for a threat. You have done well. Remain vigilant.
This is very likely to be a remnant of being a Richtofen, as Richtofen himself grows up without a soul due to Eddie's being harvested at a young age by his PRIMIS self in Dimension 2210, and this is implied to happen to all Richtofens across the multiverse. He's also stated to be willing to do whatever it takes to do right by his father, something very reminiscent of Richtofen, at least his PRIMIS self, trying so very hard to do the right thing.
My name is Edward Richtofen, and I have been trying so very hard to do the right thing.
And this may seem very far-fetched, but we've learned that Richtofen actually has a middle name from his orphanage intake documents, and we know it starts with the letter C. It's weird for Treyarch to just randomly reveal this information and for it to not be important. We've known Richtofen for 1.5 decades and had no mention of his middle name, so it makes it feel like it might be something revealed later. And just one idea I had pertaining to a raven is in fact caw. The sound that ravens make. This would be a cool way for them to slowly drip feed the information that the bastard sons may in fact be a version of them. It also is worth noting, does Janus Richtofen know that a version of him existed in this timeline previously, especially because he literally has the French syndicate employed with the direct connections to this land and has surely stumbled along the history of the area that he has been seeking for the Sentinel artifact. But just how would the original characters ever have existed in this timeline? We know that, according to the logic of the prior multiverse, a version of them should have existed in literally every universe. Once Ultimus Richtofen merged their souls with the elemental shard, an alternative version of the characters was created in every single universe. While they may have been born in different times or different parts of the world than the Ultimus versions, they all would exist somewhere and at some time, with an infinite amount of possibilities, and be destined to meet in some of them. We see a great example of this in PRIMIS, a version of the characters who meet in World War I in a timeline with far more elements 115. However, outside of these characters, the closest we ever really get to seeing just how far the infinite wells of versions of these characters goes is right after Blood of the Dead, when the PRIMIS Richtofen we know and have been following along with, who dies, is near instantly replaced with basically an exact copy from another version of the cycle. This would explain why the bastard sons now seemingly have no name and simply disappeared from history. The Tag der Toten events would have wiped every version of the characters from the universe, including them. While at first this doesn't make sense with how we have historically been interpreting the Tag der Toten ending cutscene and the new universe, thanks to new information in Citadelle Des Morts, we have to re-establish all of our interpretations of the universe transition. Our interpretation before, built from what we knew in Cold War and Vanguard, was this. Tag der Toten happens, Eddie and Sam disappear and walk into the new light, the new universe is created outside of the Dark Aether, time goes on up to the same place as Tag der Toten took place, around 1964, and then Sam and Eddie appear in this new universe as children in conjunction. However, we now know this to be false. Eddie Richtofen, according to his adoption papers, came to this universe in the 1950s, 10 years before the date of Tag der Toten. This means that the times are not necessarily parallel, and that this universe wasn't necessarily created after Tag der Toten. It may have simply been a universe relatively free from the safety of the Apothicons and Element 115, and it's where Sam and Eddie were sent to after Tag. Potentially, this new universe was simply the last universe to remain, whereas the rest of them got collapsed into the Dark Aether, as opposed to a new universe being created. But all of the Dark Aether corruption was meant to be purged from the universe, but clearly we see that failed. Or simply, when the universe was created, time didn't pass linearly to when the characters sacrificed themselves in the forest. The forest could have simply been inside of the Dark Aether, and we know time passes at a different rate. That is not the same for everyone. So it could be, in the seconds we saw Nikolai use the Agarthan device, in actuality billions of years in which there was a version of our original characters, but then they disappeared from history the second they all died and were wiped from existence, as all ether collapsed out of reality. But if it was a part of that prior multiverse at all, it at one point in time featured those 4 characters. So now the series of events seems to be that this universe existed in the prior multiverse but was relatively free from 115 or Apothicons, and a version of the original characters existed as half-brothers as the bastard sons. This would mean they were literally born here as medieval knights, as opposed to the version of the cycle we saw where PRIMIS got sent back in time on Revelations. Their lives may have begun here in this universe. As we know, in a multiverse there's an infinite amount of possibilities, so there's an infinite amount of possibilities on their birth dates, for example. Then at some point after medieval times, but before 1953, Tag der Toten takes place in another universe. The original characters across the multiverse are wiped from history, and the bastard sons are gone, leaving only their deeds and relics behind. This is why we remember their nicknames, like the stag or the dragon, but cannot remember their specific names. In fact, if we listen to the quotes from Nikolai in in the Tag der Toten ending, that is how he describes them. He describes it as if their memories are going to dissipate from all reality. However, to him, those events still happened. Their memories were still real, even if people won't be able to remember them. I'll play that for you now.
All the chapters of our lives, good and bad. Even if there was no witness, even if no one cared to see, it still happened.
This sets the Bastard Sons apart as a unique spin on these characters, because most of the time they are not blood related, nor born near this era in time. The versions we've seen often center around the First or Second World War, but these versions do not. The possible reason for this could be quite obvious. It was to separate them from the events of the Chaos story we've already seen. If this timeline really is just the same as the Chaos one, but later making the original characters pull from their Great War versions thematically and be born in medieval times. This keeps them separate from both the Chaos story and the likely future installments they had planned for it even then. It's also likely that these characters quite literally could be the bastards of the Aether, born of its dying breath. Whilst they are physical bastards as well, because the owl does not recognize their birthright, and a bastard is someone growing up without a parent, born out of wedlock, in essence, that's what these characters would be if their dying breath of the old timeline created a final, hollow version of them, since now, these integral characters would not be sent back to the Great War. It instead created a version of them in medieval times to fill that hole. This also makes the name far more poignant and effective.
In acknowledging their salute, you give the owl's best as the recognitions they always longed for.
We also know that the Aether and Dark Aether are somewhat sentient, so it could be in the final moments of the Aether, the universe was trying to course correct to reset the cycle and thus birthed a version of these characters in this timeline, so if the characters failed in the broken cycle and perished, which we do see when we play and die, a new cycle could be formed. After all, that's essentially represented whenever we die in zombies and facing the infinite waves. We are in an endless cycle, and it doesn't matter if we die. And we see many examples of alternative realities and cycles where the characters die in the music trailers for Black Ops 3. But regardless, there would be other versions out there to carry out the cycle. But of course, we ended up succeeding in breaking the cycle, and these characters maybe then faded away, or just lost what makes them them, when they lost their souls. There's also another possibility. It may be that this universe was actually the very first universe of the multiverse. One thing I constantly thought about when making my original full story video for the Aether story was just how paradoxical the original story actually is. For there to ever be a dig site in France and an Origins at all, there must have been some sort of medieval battle that happened here, with some 4 warriors. But in the first cycle, it couldn't have been PRIMIS, they hadn't even been sent back yet. That's what makes it so paradoxical. Perhaps that first run around of the cycle, the bastards were also the ones buried at the dig site in Origins, and now that all of the cycle has been wiped away, things are back as they were meant to be, back at the start. It would make sense for the true PRIMIS from the iconic PRIMIS image to have been the bastards, as originally the name PRIMIS did not quite fit. While the name translates to the first, they were in fact the last, and those named Ultimus translating to the last turn out to be seemingly the originals. And as we see, PRIMIS in Origins is actually the end of the story of the characters. And in the Canorium, Ultimus is listed as existing in the original timeline, so why are they called the last? Perhaps the first time Dr. Monty said,
Oh, hang on. Actually, that all works out perfectly.
he was coming up with the idea of simply throwing the original characters into the place of the 4 bastard sons throughout history. If this idea of them being in the original version of the cycle, before infinitely being replaced by the versions of the characters we know, the name PRIMIS on that image would make a lot of sense. We also know that Treyarch have mentioned previously that they thought of doing other stories with more characters throughout the multiverse at the end of Tag der Toten, as you can see from the quote on screen. But so far we have not seen that play out. But this could be it. Craig Houston said, with the multiverse established, there will always be other stories to imagine. But PRIMIS, Ultimus, and Victus, this is the end of the line for them, but it doesn't rule out other versions of them. Coming back to the Four Sons and how they align with the original characters, the Owl and his son seemingly occupy the keep during the year 1314. We know the Great War ends in the year 1300 from the original Aether story timeline, at least in that version of the cycle, so these time periods are very close. We also know that the Owl wanted to pit his sons against one another, with the quest we go on in the map meant to find the strongest of them, with that son finding his study.
That amulet better be in there, along with a fresh change of socks, some champagne, and a Davenport. I thought we left the worst monsters back on Terminus. Guess I was wrong.
You were always my favorite. Was your arrival here heralded by your brother's corpses? Well done. A fitting end for wretches such as they. You must pass a final test if you wish to claim the obscure Citadel. Only then will you be worthy of my respect.
I have paused Croft's calls. He cannot know what I am about to tell
for
you.
your father's honor.
The way he speaks of Director Richtofen struck me as strange.
I knew you
Let's
would
just call it a
accept
hunch.
it.
I accessed Project Genesis'
That
encrypted
is why
message
you
logs.
are my
There have been
favorite.
multiple exchanges between Croft
To be
and the
deemed
Director.
worthy of my
While I
house,
cannot access the contents
must
of their
first
communique,
defeat
it is
amulets.
clear that Croft is not being entirely honest. I would advise you proceed with caution.
However, when we entered, the study had never been found prior, possibly suggesting these sons found that they had more in common together than any of them had with their father. Perhaps this realization pushed them to reject their father's legacy and try to build one of their own, ignoring his amulet entirely and instead heading together to claim the Sentinel artifact. We do see what looks to be a statue of the owl at the base of the dig site in the one image we've seen of it in the intel for the game. Perhaps it is that the bastard sons went there to claim the Sentinel artifact on their own. We know from crafts that going there without the amulet seems to spell certain doom, and this could also explain the reason for the bastard sons seemingly disappearing, whether they managed to start the ritual or not, and this can be the premise that is explored in this DLC 2 dig site map. If they did, we may see that the bastard sons suffer a similar fate to Perseus or Medusa, being trapped inside a Sentinel trial for years, unable to escape until it's completed. Judging by when Perseus should be alive in history, by the time of Ancient Evil, he's been in that trial around 3,000 years. This means that we could very well dive into the dig site to find the bastard sons still alive and still in combat in the trial, or at the very least, some of them. While it's possible to die in the trial in combat, unless all four died, any remaining who started the trial would stay alive until its completion or their death. If, however, it's possible to start the trial without the amulet, it's also possible that this burial site is where both the owl and his sons are buried. If they died here, it opens up the possibility that this site became a memorial or burial ground, and leans us into the Origins 2 speculation that everyone has been discussing when it comes to this dig site DLC 2 map. If this map is trying to be a spiritual successor or be similar to Origins, at least story-wise, having the Four Sons buried here in a similar fashion to the PRIMIS memorial in Origins would do wonders visually for the map. Now, of course, we've already seen the layout of this map and it's visually not Origins, it's not even close to the same layout, but is the battlegrounds of the Great War and these medieval knights in a dig site in France just as Origins were. This can be this universe's version of Origins, paying homage to the map, whilst it not being a remake or remaster. Of course, like I say, this map's a dig site located nearby to Citadelle Des Morts, literally not far down the street in France. Being in France already puts it in line with Origins, but then the Citadelle Des Morts boss fight, we see rock rock pillars resembling those of the Crazy Place. They have the exact same symbols on. If this is actually the Crazy Place, it makes it all the more likely we could literally be in this new universe's version of Origins, set in exactly the same or a similar place in France with a completely different layout. And in fact, there have been leaks for dig sites that the map will apparently have these exact same pillars as the boss fight, meaning we will likely explore this new version of the Crazy Place even more on the map, with the speculation being that the point of interest we can see in Warzone is just the spawn of the map, with most of the map being underground. Potentially, we can explore the mines down to an ancient crypt or the Crazy Place, or there's a portal or something to take us to more of the Crazy Place on this map. And if we are, then the theory we postulated earlier about these bastard sons having been the ones buried at the origin site during the first cycle makes all the more sense. For we know, the very site we are visiting is exactly what Origins would have looked like during the first cycle, before PRIMIS being sent back and fought the Great War themselves, if that theory is correct, that is. But at the same time, this could very well just be the final version of the cycle. This is the final universe. Either way you look at it, the results play out similarly, that this could be a different version of Origins. And in fact, even more evidence for this is there have been leaks for the Wonder Weapon quest in the files of the game for this dig site map about energizing one or more of these Origins rock pillars. And the rock looks like one of the staff gems from Origins, really resembling either the Ice Staff or the Fire Staff gems. Both of these rocks pretty much have the same model, they're just colored differently, whereas the wind and electricity staff rocks look quite differently. So I wonder if we might be getting the staffs on this map, and thematically that would tie in if this is the burial ground of the Origins crew, just like on the original Origins. But it would be weird for us to have two maps back to back with 4 elemental wonder weapons. I don't really think Treyarch would do that, but maybe there is going to be one or more of the staffs on this map, but maybe not all of them, potentially being the ice or the fire one. I mean, we did see this alternate version of PRIMIS Richthofen have the fire gem on Blood of the Dead, which literally helped him cleanse the characters from Brutus. So I'm thinking the ice or the fire one, but one cool idea I have is, what if we have some sort of combination of all of the elements of these staffs put into one staff instead of having 4 different elemental ones? Maybe this could even be thematically representing Merlin's staff, as we've speculated that Craft is symbolically Merlin in this storyline, and it would make sense to be Merlin's staff of magic, and it has all of these elements. Maybe this staff could have even been used in how Craft is even still alive, similar to the staff of Ra, but having different effects. But speaking of the Great War, the time during this era of the Templars and Knights, like the Bastard Sons, would be the time of the Crusades. This era would be very similar to what PRIMIS already went through in the Great War, minus the monsters of course, or maybe there was monsters, but different ones, not necessarily Apothicons, more sort of the Chaos God type stuff. It would be an era of constant battle and saving their homelands, becoming heroes to the people who knew them, just like the Bastard Swords. We could be seeing a completely different iteration of the Knight Templars and the original characters who joined them, but the fate is very similar too in both times, region and actions to PRIMIS's Great War, and is very likely the sort of correction that the universe is trying to fill in the gap of the missing medieval versions of these characters with. Whether or not they are literally the same characters thematically and metatextually, they exist to fill in a gap in the universe for it and for us. In Blood of the Dead, we see an example of time having the strange ability to self-correct. In the moment another PRIMIS Richthofen enters the perception of the other 3, it's as if they can no longer perceive the one dying in the dark mechanism. In fact, those 3 have no memory of it in Alpha Omega, confirming this idea. How is this a relevant topic? Well, when the new world is created at the end of Tag to Toten, Nikolai uses the 2 most powerful items in all of existence in order to ensure the safety of the timeline, especially for Sam and Eddie. Obviously the Dark Aether and its entities ruined that somewhat, but there was no way for Nikolai to have exerted that kind of power. One very poignant moment of the ending we see, though, is our characters making various wishes, that regardless of the specifics, all ultimately come down to a willingness to live a new life. Well, what if this is just that? But they clearly didn't get their happy ending.
Comrades, as we toast our victory, I want each of you to think about what you really want. Where would you like to go now? Believe me, you can have it.
They needed to sacrifice themselves in some form to destroy the Aether, but Nikolai would surely try and avoid outright betraying his friends if there was any other way. Right, one thing he couldn't do is place the characters at the exact point they existed in previously, to live out the same lives. We've already seen what Eddie has been able to do with the best possible start, and he grew up a generation after Richtofen did, and did get a somewhat happy life at some point, starting a family, although that turned sour after they were burnt alive. So to have the characters be born at the same time they always were in the new dimension would be playing with fire, literally. But here is where all of this comes together. Just like how we see the timeline correct in Blood of the Dead, in order to ensure causality flows properly, I believe the only place the characters could go without irreparably damaging the state of the new universe is the medieval period, specifically at the end of the Crusades in the late 1200s to early 1300s. Why is that? Because if we look at PRIMIS, they actually spent the majority of their entire life in this period. They were deployed during World War I, but disappeared from northern France essentially straight away, then hopped around dimensions before ending up in that late Crusade period to fight in the Great War, where they became legends but their names were lost to history, with no negative repercussions on the present day. To Nikolai, considering how he could honour his and his friends' wishes whilst giving Eddie and Sam the best chance, this is the only place they could go. In correcting this aspect of the timeline, they would be born during the Crusades and live out their lives there. This could even give insight to the Raven harnessing the element of shadow, literally void, the absence of, as he would definitely lack any kind of soul. We know from leaks the original crew are likely set to return in COD 2025 as stated at the beginning. But I've gone off on a major tangent from that, but let's wrap it back to how this can all make sense in terms of tying the Bastard Sons into the original crew. We've talked about signs this is coming already. For instance, the biggest reason we suggested it was unlikely is that their souls were bonded with Element 115. However, with Modern Warfare Zombies, we saw the return of Element 115, and the ray gun now mentions Element 115 being fused with cold fusion technology to power the ray gun in Black Ops 6 Zombies, as it was initially stated in the terminal in Black Ops 1, but was a story note that was never mentioned again, until now. If Element 115 is returning to this universe, then it was simply thrown into the Dark Aether, along with everything else at the end of Tag the Totem.
When we are gone, so too is everything that spewed forth from the ether. Element 115, the Apothecaries, even Monty himself, all of it will be banished to where it belongs. The Dark Aether.
Would this not also mean the return of these souls bound to it? We also hear from the Terminus intel on the ether generators in the tower that it has the voice of an angry Russian man talking to a German girl inside of it. While we have speculated that this is likely the Russian Zykov, with Fred Tatarskior, who voices Nikolai, returning to voice the Mangler already, him being Nikolai's voice actor, it's not out of the question it could potentially be him instead. We know that Panos has now used the LTG to demonstrate using the essence of others to bring yourself back, and it's likely this method is also going to be used to bring Richtofen's family back in some way, with the Sentinel artifact and Prima Materia being used to create their bodies. With this happening, could it be an introduction in returning characters to life via their essence to set us up for exactly how this will happen with the original characters? We know from the Insider Gaming leak about the characters' return that it will somehow be tied to their essence, as apparently there's going to be a new villain that wants to return the multiverse to existence by extracting and bringing back the essence and soul of the original characters. So this lines up with what we know. This version we've heard of is apparently not PRIMIS and not Ultimus, but rather an entirely new alternative version of these characters. So whilst we have been saying maybe we could be playing as Janice Richtofen we see in this game alongside 3 new versions of themselves, I personally believe that this version of Richtofen will not be relevant for that game, or at least will be maybe put in the background story, whether he gets a happy end at the end of this game or something like that. Could it be that the Bastards are actually the new incarnation of these characters that we had leaked to us earlier? If not, they would be a version we've yet to see at all. We also know some Dark Force, likely the Shadowsmiths, are set to attempt to harvest their essence and return the multiverse to reality. If this happens inside the Dark Aether, could a new multiverse be created within it? Would this mean even more versions of these characters, even outside of the ones we play as? We could end up, from there, exploring some open-ended things from the Aether story, like the giant radios. In those, we hear alternative versions of the characters discussing murdering Richtofens across the timeline.
It is not all bad news, Nikolai. We may have failed in our mission, but at least there is now one less Richtofen to deal with. If it is any consolation, tell him that the first one is the hardest. I should know. I've killed at least 3 Richtofens. There was the one in the fire, the one with the bolt hook, And the one... What? No one told me. Sorry. Forget what I just said. Everything will be fine.
We also know from the leak that we are going to, in some way, see an 8-player zombies game for COD 2025. If this is the case, who could the other 4 characters be? The Requiem crew seemingly give up their essence to the machine in Urzikstan. It is possible their souls are somehow preserved in the Dark Aether, and they fight alongside the original characters in a fully Dark Aether game. Could it be that we learn that Samuel's soul was somehow still preserved in the Dark Aether as well, and this will be the same process by which Requiem preserve their souls as well? If they did it intentionally, it would explain the willingness to abandon their bodies and die so easily after they are all gone, perhaps never truly die in COD Zombies, as even Dr. Monty, who was essentially a god, said death was a whole other can of worms. And Ravenov says that he might have not been the one that should have been left behind in Modern Warfare Zombies, implying that the Requiem crew are in fact somewhere else, meaning that they may be living out as souls in the Dark Aether. And considering that Samuel, if he does come back, stays dead for decades, could it be that the same may happen to Requiem? Could it be that their essence is preserved up to Modern Warfare Zombies ending before they reappear in the Dark Aether, allowing Ava, who was taken into the Dark Aether by the Shadowsmiths and is probably needed in some key way in bringing back Requiem and the original characters to all exist together in this storyline? As insane as it sounds, it's quite possible, especially considering we know that COD 2025's campaign is seemingly set in 2035. The weapons would be appropriate for a sequel to Modern Warfare Zombies, which is set in 2021, so we could follow up a decade or so later, so it corresponds with the campaign story. So yeah, personally I do think that maybe these bastard sons could be the versions of the original characters that we play as in COD 2025 Zombies. But they won't be PRIMIS in name. This would be a different version of them, the bastard selves, but I think it's more than likely that if they got purged, maybe the fact that the Bastard Sons exist could just be the way the original characters are reintroduced into the storyline, and there's some connection with them in maybe trying to restore their essence from remnants left over of them, maybe even in their burial ground in the dig site, and then maybe that will lead to us seeing an alternative version of the characters if the multiverse is successfully restored in the Dark Aether, to explore a completely different version of the original characters, different from even these bastard versions themselves, if we are correct on this theory, because they obviously have apparently died long ago. It would make sense to now see a different version of them, especially one that is so different from their medieval selves that we have already seen before. And finally, if these characters come back, how do we make sure that Tag der Toten still matters? They could still technically be dead, and we are only playing as etheric essence or souls inside of the Dark Aether. Perhaps we will simply exist as these ghost warriors inside of this realm who fight forever to keep it closed, and from then on separate the campaign and the COD shared universe. We can have a multiverse instead of the Dark Aether, but then a regular universe where all the campaign stuff happens. This would allow the stories to once again separate themselves from the time period of the campaign and open up more Black Ops 3 scale stories once again, where more craziness happens in the maps without it having to affect the overarching COD universe. I think this would be a good way to sort of follow up on the ending of Tag der Toten. These characters' souls are now basically trapped in a cycle once again, forever protecting the Dark Aether from within, from seeping out and destroying the world. They will fight alongside us back to back forever, with many versions of them as well, because I personally think if the multiverse is going to be restored, whatever version we play as, which will probably be a new version we have not seen, whether it's the Bastard Sons or a completely different version of the original characters, I think there'll be, again, an infinite amount of them fighting somewhere in the Dark Aether if the multiverse is back. But what do you think? Let me know if you think the Bastards may be the original characters, and if so, exactly what do you think is going to happen to bring them back? Who do you think each of the animals actually are as well? Do you agree with my hypotheses and connections with who I think they are? Maybe one or two will be off, but I think generally we've got it nailed on. Will we play as the Bastard Sons or other versions of them? Let me know your thoughts down below. This has been a very long video, but we have plenty more coming soon. I'm going to be making a follow-up video talking more about the storyline of the Owl and the ancient history of the medieval times and the Templar Knights on Citadelle Des Morts and this dig site map, because the Owl is going to be very relevant on that map as well. And that'll tie more into everything with the Bastard Sons and the original characters. But anyways, thank you for watching the video. Make sure to subscribe if you're not for the latest and greatest Call of Duty news and information. So anyways, thank you for watching, and bye.